Okay, I think we're recording now. So I figured we'd go ahead and do a preview of this thing. Chad, you are in Huntington right now,
That's right.
and I am up near the great metropolitan area of Chester, West Virginia. Um, so, you know, I figured we'd do a preview of this book we've been working towards, and I know it's been, several months since we started the research now, and you've got a life and and a and an intense job. I've got a job and a family, and I don't know if I would say I have a life, but but we've managed to work our way through a lot of the heavy lifting up front that you got to do for a book project like this since since March, I believe, when we kind of were sitting at one of our favorite little hangouts in Charleston after hours in the legislature. Um, Nice little restaurant down the road from the Capitol there, and I think I was carrying one of those classic works with me. I pulled off my shelf, and you noticed it, and it's sort of kind of the project kind of took off from there, and it was your idea really. Um, but we've got some of the actual writing done in this book right now, and sometimes it's just a good exercise to discuss some of the early thoughts after the research portion, of a book is more or less done. To sort of flesh out the ideas, um, and I think it can be especially important to do, when you have a book that's being jointly written or co-authored. And I know we both thought this sort of conversation might be good to make public too, because it might have some value in itself for some folks out there. So I thought we just discuss a couple of the major themes of the book we're preparing, some of the background a bit, and maybe a couple of things that sort of might come to mind. Um, when we were talking about this originally, um, this there's two guys we sort of settled on for this book, and one is a household name, Martin Luther King Jr., and then you have another guy that is not exactly a household name. I mean, I don't think anybody really would recognize Boethius unless you have, like a PhD in one of the literary arts or something like that, or liberal arts degrees. But he's certainly sort of gone by the wayside by now. But I guess I don't know. It was interesting when you proposed this, because when I was reading this, I had also not terribly long ago read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter to a Birmingham jail, and it's very interesting. And I couldn't remember all the details about it, but I remember it was a beautifully written letter, and was thinking when I was just reading Boethius's most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy, um, about different guys who were imprisoned and unjustly, and had written works in prison, and apparently there's sort of um, uh, a unique discipline out there with a name to it of prison literary works or something. I can't remember the technical term for that, but I thought it was I was sort of thinking that way, and you just sort of proposed this, and so here we are, I guess. But I can sort of set the stage, and I'll turn it over to you in a minute to add some perspective here from your point of view, because we have two men we're riding on, two men from vastly different eras who probably couldn't be more different. If you deliberately try to make it so. One is on the one hand this ancient Roman that, like we said, 99% of the public today has never heard of Boethius, and the other is this, a fairly contemporary African American who is practically a household name, at least in the United States, Martin Luther King Jr. But when we settled on these two guys to write about, we figured out that they actually have, in some respects, much more in common than you might otherwise think at first glance. Martin Luther King Jr. And Boethius. So when we look at both of them, even the time periods that they lived out were not all that terribly different conceptually. You have on the one hand Martin Luther King Jr., who's living through all the turbulent times of the 1960s. A lot of social friction, both culturally and politically. It's a transitional sort of time period, and we can notice this, maybe only after, we look back on it in hindsight, but everyone today, thinks of this period, for better or for worse, as some sort of major shift in change in American history. But when we look way back towards the era that this lesser known guy today existed and lived through, Boethius, in the late fifth and early sixth centuries, which is some 1,500 years ago. We can use a lot of those same descriptions for his own time and place. The century prior to Boethius's life, the Roman Empire had pretty much collapsed, at least in the West. And it was completely gone. But you had Roman families that were still around, and for many of them, they didn't really believe at the time that Roman civilization was necessarily over with. They didn't believe that Rome was going extinct, so to speak. The entire Italian peninsula, though, was now under the rule of these Goths, these barbarians. That first it was the Visigoths, and then their sort of eastern cousins, the Ostrogoths. So by Boethius's day in Rome, not only do you have the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but the whole of Italy, the whole Italian peninsula is ruled by a barbarian king, and the entire continent really of Europe is underneath the grip of one barbarian faction or another. Yet all these Roman institutions are still around. There's still a Roman Senate. The old Roman aristocracy is still around, and Boethius very much comes from this very traditional, powerful family with its ties going all the way back towards the beginnings of the Republic. So he comes from, you could say, pretty good stock. So I guess one way for people to understand just how good of stock he came from would be maybe comparing it to something like if you, Chad, are descended from maybe one of our founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson or a Patrick Henry is like your great grandfather, and then every significant political figure in between is somehow related to you, or you're like from the Kennedy household or something. That's basically Boethius's lineage. His family has some very powerful political ties that go back centuries, and is more or less he's from a dynasty, but one that is going extinct, and so I guess to contrast this, and I'll say this real briefly, and we'll get to. I really want to get into that letter from the Birmingham jail, but I'll say this real briefly, just to contrast Boethius's culture that's on its way out. I just don't think they realize it completely yet. With the barbarians, they're now living underneath. The barbarians are illiterate. The Goths are by and large illiterate. They can't read, they can't write. Not even the Gothic king who Boethius ends up serving in politics. this guy named King Theodoric. He can't even read or write. Boethius, on the other hand, is this brilliant scholar who has one of the last libraries actually in Italy, and it's said to be this like the marvel of Rome. At the time, a huge collection of all the Greek classics he has in his own library that were by this time, very important to Roman intellectual culture, from Aristotle to Plato, not just Greek philosophy now, but he's also got all the Christian theology and philosophy, Augustine, and some of the other guys like Jerome. And so Boethius, who ends up, by the way, being canonized in the Catholic Church, much later on as a saint, he has all these works from the Church Fathers, and especially he's very familiar with St. Augustine's writings, who had lived and died, about 100 years before Boethius had. But the biggest commonality between the two guys we're writing this book on, and it's what drove us to write the book in the first place that we mentioned. These were two Christian men, both of them unjustly imprisoned, and while they were serving out their sentences in a jail cell, one in the was it the late 1950s, early 60s, in Birmingham, Alabama.
63.
63. Okay, yeah, and the other, was in prison in this small town north of Rome, in 523 A.D. I think I've got that right. They both wrote these pretty magnificent works in literature, and the works they wrote, are classics in and of themselves, but they're like classics based on the classics. So their work, along with the events and the character of the men themselves surrounding the writing of their work here, is really sort of the main focus of our book, I guess. So of course, the work you've been just poring over has been Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter from a Birmingham jail, and I think I'm just going to let you say a few words on that, because I know it's like I've read it since we started writing. You've been focused on doing a lot of the heavy load research with Martin Luther King, and I've been focused on Boethius, sort of the division of labor here, and we'll end up swapping at some point, after we do the rough draft, and so we're knowledgeable about both. But I think it's some versions online I see it's like 6 or 7 pages, and others but he wrote it. I think he hand wrote it though from the jail. So
yeah, there's a lot packed in there. So yeah, it was a really neat beginning to the project, and like many great works of philosophy, started over chicken wings after a long day at the Capitol, and
yeah.
You were carrying a book around, and I like to look at it, and I said, I've never heard of this. I've never heard the word or the name Boethius. And so we were sitting there, and you were explaining to me, hey, here's this guy. He's in prison. He's facing imminent execution, and his consolation, the thing that gets him through is his lady philosophy. And then that kind of morphed into a discussion of, have you ever noticed that a lot of great works are written by people who are imprisoned? And we talked about, some of that is, what else do you have to do? You're confined. You have a lot of time to think. And so it kind of made sense that in this condition of incarceration, that there is a creative opportunity, because you don't have all the, like we talked earlier, life, and family and jobs and all that. And so I would imagine that it's very ripe for introspection, reflection. And so we started talking about that, and we started like looking on our phones at a list, many of which I wasn't even aware were written by people while they were incarcerated. And so that's kind of how it started. Then as we kind of started, narrowing down, like, the pieces to talk about, and the idea of writing about this shared condition, we kind of settled on I would say an ancient, but a classic, Boethius, and then more of a contemporary. And what's been amazing to me as we've gone through the process and shared bits of research is so much commonality, not just the condition of being incarcerated, but King, like Boethius, took his consolation in philosophy. And, three times in his very short letter, relatively, cites Socrates and goes back to his trial in Plato's Apology. He cites St. Thomas Aquinas. He cites St. Augustine. And so we started seeing these not only common conditions, common process of introspection, but going back to the same well, if you will, of philosophy of the ancients to be consoled in this time of turmoil. So to kind of set the stage on King, like you did with Boethius, we're back in 1963. So in the beginning of April, like the 3rd, Birmingham is probably one of, if not the most segregated cities in America. So King has a group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they go around and have sit-ins and activism. So back on, I think, April the 3rd of '63, King and his group show up in Birmingham. There's another local group called the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, and the two groups kind of combine, and they decide to start direct action, the sit-ins, the protests, and all that. So on the 10th, after about a week, the powers that be do not like this, and they go to a circuit judge there named Jenkins, and they get him to issue an injunction that says no parading, no demonstrating, no boycotting, no trespassing. It is shut down. All right, no protests. King says, I'm going to protest. And this is what kind of sets the stage. And he does it anyway with the group in violation of the injunction. He is arrested on Good Friday. Interesting. On the 12th
I
of
didn't know that. Wow.
yeah, April 12th. He's arrested and he's taken to the Birmingham jail, which is not the nicest of accommodations.
I can imagine. I
Yeah.
can imagine.
So the next day, okay, the 13th, an ally secretly smuggles in a newspaper from the 12th, okay, which I guess was an evening newspaper because it mentioned his arrest. And there was an op-ed in that newspaper. Okay. It was called A Call for Unity. And it was written by 8 white Alabama clergymen criticizing King and these methods. And so the letter from a Birmingham jail is King's response to that op-ed. He started writing it in the margins of that paper, okay? And then as he ran out of room, there was a trustee working in the jail who smuggled in some scraps of paper. And then when those ran out, he had met with his lawyer who gave him a legal pad, and he wrote the rest of it on the pad. So the letter is actually started on the actual newspaper. It was in response to some scraps of paper and then went to a legal pad. And so the idea of the letter is King is answering the criticisms of the white clergy who said, wait a minute, you're being hypocritical to say on one hand, the country needs to obey the law, Brown versus Board Education in 54, and must integrate, but yet you're disrespecting the law by violating these injunctions. Now, of course, that sets King, right into the path of a just versus unjust law. And so he begins by saying, I reject your criticism, and here's why. And that gets him into Augustine and Aquinas. And then he kind of defends the action. And that's where he kind of goes back to Socrates and Plato's Apology.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just wanted to say something, because when I reread that letter, after you'd poured over it, I finally, put Boethius down. I've got my original copy from English Literature 101 or something my sophomore year in college. I'll just say what jumped out at me from my perspective when reading that letter from a Birmingham jail and perhaps it's just my background as a Catholic, but the key to refuting the attack on him, Martin Luther King Jr.'s key to refuting the entire attack on him by this Southern Christian organization of clergymen who I don't know too much about. It all hinges on turning to Thomas Aquinas, and the framework St. Thomas provides with his natural law tradition. But so what jumped out at me though is that here's a Protestant, and by all accounts, a deeply evangelical Protestant, named after the foremost Protestant reformer from the 16th century, who, by the way, had explicitly rejected the theology of Thomas Aquinas in the 16th century when, he was doing his 95 thesis, I believe it was, nailing it to the, he had written a huge tract against Thomas's, it's too rational, only faith, only scripture. So, but you have this in the background, but here's King sort of resurrecting Thomas Aquinas to rather convincingly, he just eviscerated the logic that these guys attacked him on. He just put down this public attack on the validity of what Martin Luther King was doing, and that was really remarkable. And I think that another thought I had, in some ways, even though MLK's time frame during the decade of the 60s is thought of as being this countercultural movement, I think that this logic he employs, from not just Aquinas, but from also, like you said, St. Augustine, which he sort of uses as a premise to then go into Aquinas, it's very much the opposite of countercultural. It's very traditional. It's very conservative in the classic meaning of the term.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought that was fascinating, and I think it speaks to the breadth of knowledge that King was drawing from on this very Western tradition that he was very aware of, and that he was. It was a brilliant way to put down this. It could be said rather disingenuous attack on King's methods and motives. So
no, anyway. Absolutely right. And I mean, he kind of starts off by, he's being attacked for hypocrisy with the law, and so I think very simply says, look, there's really two kinds of law. I mean, there's just and unjust, and just like you have a not only legal but a moral duty to obey just laws. The converse of that is you have a legal and moral responsibility to disobey laws that are unjust. And so that's when he kind of gets into Augustine, that I think it's that an unjust law is no law at all. So he says, and this is where he kind of turns that right into that civil disobedience that really in many ways he's known for, but goes far beyond him. And he says that not only if an individual breaks a law that is unjust, and furthermore, and this is important too, willingly accepts the consequence, all the way up to imprisonment or death, and does so for the purpose of arousing the conscience of the community to its injustice, then that person is really not only they're not disrespecting the law, they're showing the highest respect for the law. And so there's a number of things to unpack there. It's not only, we need to determine, is it just or unjust? Then we have to do it for the right reason. Then we have to do it with a loving spirit, as opposed to, some criticism or complaining about it all the time. And when all that is done, it certainly is no disrespect of the law. It may be the law in its highest form. And so I thought that was pretty amazing. And then he uses Aquinas when he says, how do we determine what's just, what's unjust? We've got these two drawers. How do we know? And basically, he says that if the law is not rooted in an eternal and natural law, then it's not just. And so that's his test. And once you apply the test, then you have two duties: obey just and disobey unjust. And so that's kind of how he goes in with the letter. Now, when you said, like me, kind of surprised at how much of the classics were part of King's. So then we started talking, well, where did this come from? I mean, what is his background? And so,
Yeah. You
that's
pulled
what.
up. Yeah, you pulled up some very cool stuff.
Yeah, Morehouse College was his undergrad, so to speak, and there he takes some classes according to the research. He takes some classes in not some beginning philosophy, but he's also exposed to Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience, which gets into some of the same stuff. Yeah, but it's when he gets to Crozer Theological Seminary for his postgraduate, theological or seminary work. We actually were able to get some of the syllabi of the courses. And there's no question. I mean, that's where he's definitely, if he hasn't got into it before, he's turned on very much so into Plato and Aristotle. And there are classes. It's a non-denominational seminary. He's one of, I think, 12 or 13 African American students, and they kind of run the gamut. And so there he really gets into some of this. And I think that when you get into the letter, the 3 times, for instance, that he goes to Socrates, probably 2 of them are from the Apology and 1 from the Credo, which also, Socrates is in jail, which is interesting in that one, right? And so his student comes and he's trying to talk him into escaping, and he's saying, that would be unjust. So it's an interesting, for me, it was kind of interesting why he went to that and how he went to that. And if you think about, the Apology, which we had to go back and kind of read, Socrates is on trial for his life, and, he's charged with some stuff like, being irreligious and kind of,
corrupting the youth.
Yeah. And so in his trial, Socrates references, says, look, you can kill me, all right, sure, but I am basically called by God to be the gadfly that buzzes around this big horse of Athens that's slow and lumbering and doesn't really move much or quickly. And my function is to pester it until it moves. So you can kill me, but there will be another fly that comes. And so that's kind of what King was saying. I mean, you can take fire hoses and dogs, and you may kill me and take my life, but someone else will take my place. And eventually, this lumbering, slow horse of society, whether it have the Athenian Society for Socrates or U.S. and the Civil Rights Movement, it's going to move. And so that gets into that accepting with joy the suffering that you're going to have, because you're stirring it to action. And so Plato and King talk about creating a tension, and the Socratic method. I mean, that we've talked about as a teaching technique is designed to create some tension in your mind in answering the question that forces you to kind of reevaluate your own opinions. And so it's that same method that I think Socrates brings, and why King goes to him so much to say, I'm not just out here raising hell for no purpose. I'm here to create tension, and tension is what causes big, slow horses to move. And so that's what I'm going to do. And so I thought it was pretty appropriate that he go back to the Apology. But as you and I talked about, I mean, it's pretty amazing that centuries apart and worlds apart in people and places and experiences, both men draw on this common well when they find themselves staring down an uncertain fate, but one that's probably not going to end well, and didn't for either of them.
It didn't. Yeah, it didn't for Martin Luther King Jr. or yeah, right. I mean, he wasn't executed at the end of his prison sentence, but it didn't end well. He stuck with his purpose, which is what you were describing. Almost reminds me of being like the conscience of the community or something like that. And it's sort of almost for a second there, the way you were describing what Socrates was saying in Plato's famous dialogue, the Apology, is, something like a John the Baptist would say, and someone is going to come. And of course, as Christians ourselves, we're very much aware that is the Christ, but it definitely there's something that resonates there with what he's saying, and it is a little bit I guess ironic, or I don't know what the right word would be, in the fact that we chose these guys and then we realized that they were both consoled by philosophy with, one the title is named that with Boethius, but that's definitely something that was consoling King and helping him put down, public attacks. So it sort of reminds me of Cicero's famous work that on duties, which reconciled the useful with the honorable, which was kind of neat. But yeah, Boethius's work is it's a beautiful little book, and this one is let's see, before you get to the bibliography, 160 pages or whatever, but it's written in prose and verse, which is really goofy. So I've read it a couple times since, my college days, where I have these scribble scrabble in the back here from when I was 20 years old, and definitely as a youngster not able to really appreciate this, but it definitely made him a cultural icon, and even with everything else that he wrote, just this alone made him this cultural icon throughout the high Middle Ages in Europe. And there's this famous Italian Renaissance scholar has this sort of enduring quote about Boethius, that he was the last of the Romans and the first of the scholastics, meaning the first of the Catholic schoolmen, that later emerged after the last of the barbarian conflicts sort of went by the wayside with the Vikings, and intellectual life was able to resume in Europe. These Catholic scholars doing this scholastic method kind of emerged, and Boethius has this huge impact on them. He's not just living in a transitional time period like we mentioned before, but he was himself a transitional figure in his own right. So he was a politician, which ultimately did him in. But Martin Luther King Jr. was definitely engaged in politics. But Boethius, that definitely got him into some trouble and led to his execution. But he considered himself a scholar first. And according to a couple sources I've glanced at and read through, it's maintained that he really considered himself the sort of the schoolmaster of the West during this time frame. Because by Boethius's day, the Greek language in the Latin West was pretty much dead. The empire of the Romans had split into two earlier on, a couple centuries before, and the Eastern Empire in Constantinople was still around, but no one in Italy or the rest of Western Europe could really read or write in Greek, or very few anyway. But Boethius could. So he had been raised in this very educated family, and he knew the Greek language very well. And this was extremely key because Greek philosophy is all written in Greek. Maybe the one famous exception, Cicero had written in Latin, but philosophy, even written by the Romans, was always written in Greek. Marcus Aurelius, for instance, the famous Stoic emperor from the 2nd century, wrote his Meditations, a Stoic work, in Greek. So one of his Boethius's huge achievements for the West was translating the works of the big Greek philosophers like Aristotle into Latin, because these works were vanishing. Like we had talked about, barbarians who are illiterate, they don't have much use for libraries or for books. So these famous works from like Plato and Aristotle, were becoming just scarce resources. So Boethius translates some key works by Aristotle in the science of logic into Latin, and this alone, I think, probably would have made Boethius extremely key in the furtherment in the development of the West, because with this one exception, Boethius's translations of some of Aristotle's logic, the rest of Aristotle's works were pretty much lost to the West until they were, recovered again, sometime in the late 12th and 13th centuries. So Boethius's translations, though, it stuck around and, enabled some of those early thinkers, the Catholic schoolmen, the scholastics like Anselm in the 11th century, to advance some key ideas, hundreds of years after Boethius was gone. But the consolation of philosophy, it's his most famous work, and it's hard to underscore, I think, really just how popular this little book was in Europe for the next 1,000 years or so, because people like, and I didn't know this, only after just doing all this research, that Queen Elizabeth had famously translated the Consolation of Philosophy from Latin into English, towards the end of her reign in the 16th century, in the Elizabethan era. She was depressed, she had some problems towards the end of her reign, and so she took consolation and actually translating the Consolation from Latin into English, and it became the symbol of status to read the Consolation of Philosophy or to comment on it, but I think what makes it just so enduring is that it's just incredibly well written, especially given the circumstances under which it was written. But just I'll quickly just go over, and we don't want to make this too long, but Boethius had been promoted to high office by this barbarian king, King Theodoric, and he really wasn't that honest of a guy early on, but he seemed like he had matured and was some of the sources say he actually wasn't that bad for a barbarian, quote unquote. But the office Boethius held was sort of a new office the king had created. It was something like a secretary of state and a chief of staff. He was sort of like the king's chief diplomat, but he also handled a lot of the administrative work throughout Italy. So all the sources though indicate Boethius was a very noble kind of guy. He carried out his duties very well. But his luck just ran out. He fell out of favor with the king. He was accused of treason. It was almost certainly a set-up job. He was falsely accused, almost definitely, and it looks like he could have been part of this purge, because many other prestigious Romans during the same time frame were suddenly arrested and thrown into prison along with Boethius, including Boethius's stepfather, actually, who was also this prestigious aristocrat in Rome. And there was, you can go back at throughout history and see some similarities between Boethius, who feels it's his duty because he is this sort of dedicated disciple of the philosophers, to sort of be like a Platonic philosopher king, not in himself, but advise at least, the new barbarian king and do his duty. It typically doesn't end well for any of these guys, because, Seneca did the same thing with Nero. The famous Stoic philosopher Seneca tried to counsel Nero early on, and it doesn't end up well for Seneca when Nero matures and kind of loses it. Another purge, Seneca is forced to commit suicide, and you go back. I think the only guy maybe that actually ended up for the better of it maybe is actually Aristotle, when he tutored Alexander the Great, but was famously the most wealthy, or the most highly paid tutor or philosopher in all of philosophy, and he sort of, I guess, made it out in the nick of time before Alexander, maybe would have had him off too. But Boethius, uh, he has everything going for him. He's at the top of the world. He's pretty much as high up as you can go in politics at the time. He has this incredible family. It said he has his beautiful wife. Both of his sons were they were made consuls. They were both anointed as consuls. And the consulship wasn't the same thing as it was back in the good Republican days. But the position was still there, and it was said to have been the first time in the Roman world where you had two sons who served as co-consuls. So he has everything going for him, and then all of a sudden, it all comes crashing down, and not only is all this taken from him, but his reputation's in ruins. He's rotting in a prison. He's facing the death penalty, and so he's basically living out. This is what I sort of found neat. He's kind of living out the story of Job from the Old Testament, and only it doesn't end well for Boethius, right? I mean, he is eventually executed, and it's not pretty. He is executed in a very brutal way. Um, no one knows for sure, but it looks like the consensus is he's dragged out and forced to kneel, and then this sort of Gothic, literally barbaric tactic is done where a rope is tied around his head, and it's pulled tight until his eyes pop out, and then he's beaten to death with clubs to sort of finish the job. And Boethius knows this is all coming. He probably knows the way he's going to be executed, because he knows the Gothic culture, and these are the conditions he's riding under when he writes his most famous work. Um, so it's got a lot of Stoic ethics sort of in it, more overriding sort of ethics or piece to it, though, is probably in the tradition of Plato, Platonic ethics. But there's definitely some Stoicism, um, which kind of attracts me to it, because it's sort of, you can notice it, especially up front, where Boethius is just in the front part of his book, The Consolation, is just sobbing. He's literally crying, and it appears like he's having this mental breakdown in his prison cell. Um, and then Lady Philosophy, or perhaps Lady Wisdom, um, whichever way you want to refer to her, appears to him, and then the book goes from there, and it's written as this dialogue between himself in his actual prison, and for the first time, actually, um, this virtue of wisdom, or literally of philosophy itself, personified in a human form, or this female character. So it's like he's speaking to virtue itself, or reason, or um, um, philosophy, the love of wisdom, however you want to define it. And and it's interesting in that, because it's it the first, they're using, Lady Philosophy is using these terms as like applying medicine to, like, philosophy is almost like applying medicine to the soul to heal Boethius's wrong-headed thinking, and the distress that it's caused him. So I find that that part is pretty fascinating, I guess. And I guess I'll just say one other thing that I really kind of always pondered myself as a Catholic. It's this idea that Boethius is sort of pent up on, is about free will and virtue, um, but it's a different kind. He writes about free will and he's trying to tackle the problem of evil. And you and I have had some pretty extensive conversations about this because, the atheists today, um, and I'm not trying to put atheists down or anything of that nature because I definitely have had my doubts in the past. This is a very serious problem to try to figure out, and he's trying to take it on. But the atheists today will spit this problem out, and they don't. But some of them will go through the motions and really try to understand it, and then they just can't make any sense of it. But some of them are maybe less than genuine and just sort of throw it out, and don't think anything further about it. But Boethius is really um, trying to solve and reconcile the problem of evil. And the age-old problem of evil is, how do you reconcile the Almighty, the all-powerful, all-loving God with the existence of human suffering or evil in the world? And Boethius sort of brings this a particular focus with this problem, which is I really like, because like Job from the Old Testament, Boethius wants to know why the virtuous are 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 not rewarded, and why the wicked are not punished. And specifically in Boethius's case, it seems as if the exact reverse is taking place.
Right.
The wicked are actually rewarded, and the virtuous are punished. And for a person who is very much where virtue means everything to him almost, because he sort of associates virtue with coming from emanating from the Almighty. You can see why this is something that he really wants to understand, and I don't want to give away how he solves it, but I guess I'll just touch real quickly on the most famous part of the book, which comes after he's talking about the problem of evil, and he's trying to kind of reconciles it. And that is in the last chapter of the book. Boethius raises this problem, which was an important problem to solve, especially in the time period he's living in. Like I say, especially for someone like him who strongly believes that virtue is one of the highest goods, and for virtue to exist, free will has to be tied to its hip. But how can free will authentically exist within the individual at the same time as God's divine foresight? So, in other words, if God knows every little thing you are ever going to do, every choice you will ever make in the future, from your birth to your death on this planet, in this world, how can it be said that the individual genuinely possesses free will? And this is a problem for Boethius. And he even cites at one point Cicero, or I think it's actually Lady Philosophy, is saying, hey, my student Cicero tried to tackle this, and just basically says he wasn't any good at it. And when I went back and read the where they were citing Cicero's sort of attempt to take on this issue, he basically just kind of gave up and said, I think it's all nonsense, or something like that. But Boethius, it's very unique how he solves the problem, and I won't go through it right now, but it can be satisfying for some. For others, they might not find his solution very very satisfying, I guess. But I do. I like the way he put it. So, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely worth the read, and the intent with the book is not to just sort of rehash what they wrote, but it's sort of to intertwine the story of their life around this specific moment in their life when they are going through this duress. Both individuals are going through this this adversity, and they write these incredible works that are beautiful in and of themselves. And for whatever reason, they both, even though they're separated by 1,500 years, they turn to the classics for consolation and to get some answers, some useful answers for themselves. And there's something to be said for that.
Well, and that's the point that we've talked about over and over, that just the fact that these two men did this in these instances at these times shows you that there is still relevance to the study of these things. 1963 was not that long ago. And so, this is not some ancient, literature. This is stuff that today in 2019 has just as much relevance. Today, people walk around and ask the same question, believers and non-believers, about the existence of evil. And so, these are problems man has wrestled with since he was here and will wrestle with from till he's gone. And so the fact that we have this to lean on and draw from is important. And so I hope people take from this that there is still relevance today in contemporary issues and contemporary problems to apply the classics. For me, with King, most folks, let's say, know about the "I Have a Dream" speech. Some have some exposure to Birmingham jail, or I've been to the mountaintop, which was a speech he gave the day before he was assassinated in Memphis, right, in which he talks about the Greek and Roman empires. So this was certainly something on his mind. And he said, I could have been born, sitting in Athens. I could have been part of the Roman Empire, but fate, God, has put me here in this moment, in this place. And when I take all that in, I'm right where I'm supposed to be at this time, at this place. And so I think that King offers a more contemporary, but a different perspective that a reader could say, I too am here and now in this place, and have this material available to me. When you mentioned Job, there's so much. I mean, both of us are believers, and there is certainly it's not a religious book, but there are certainly religious elements to these men and the backstories particularly. But for me, one of the major connections with King, he is a resistor, of this civil rights movement. He's also a minister. And the more I went backwards, pre-63, and read about his background, his training, his education, back in about 58, he puts out his first book called Stride Toward Freedom. It's a discussion of the Montgomery bus boycotts, and he lists like 6 elements of successful resistance. And number 5 is that the resistor should be motivated by love, and he says in the Greek sense of agape, that pure love of a human being without interest of self. And so when I went back and kind of studied, it makes sense, that this Baptist preacher, would have this background. And it took me, like with you, with Job and the discussion of suffering with Boethius, into some of the Pauline epistles. And, Corinthians, Paul describes that agape love as love that does not seek things for itself. It sustains all things. It believes all things, hopes all things. It endures all things, and it never fails. I think how it ends. And so it's that love that motivates King, and King posits motivates the successful person who wants to stand up to say evil or oppressive authority. And so I just thought, it's a very interesting. We have these two men. They both go back and lean heavily on the classics, but they also go back to this love through and is God, and how it's to be expressed towards your fellow man. So it's pretty fascinating, and I hope that people come away with it, I've been exposed to Boethius. Never knew that before you. And I hope people come away not only learning some things about these two men that they didn't know, and learn, maybe even more importantly, or as importantly, learn about the things that motivated or consoled them. And then most importantly, I hope they come away with some thought of how can I take these men and these works and apply them in my life to make progress as a human, because I think that's what I've really enjoyed about the process. So hopefully they take that away from it.
Yeah, those are some good words, man. Yeah, I totally agree, and I've learned a whole lot about Martin Luther King that I had never known before. So it's been a pleasure for me to learn about him as well, and some of the details that he was going through in his life, and his thought process, from his perspective. So, I think the book we're shooting to, we were going to try to get it out a little earlier, but I think it was wise for us to sort of wait a little bit and make sure we get everything sort of right, and so it's more enjoyable for the reader. And so we're shooting to have it out right around the Christmas time frame, and I think it's come along pretty nice. And so we'll probably be in touch with anyone that's paying attention here fairly soon. We have a working title. It's what was the working title? You came up with a title. Long thoughts and long prayers, I believe. Was that it?
Something like that.
We've been a
Short
little bit
title. Well, yeah.
into the details. We really aren't concerned with the title. The title will come, but we'll figure that one out sooner rather than later. But anyway, it's good talking to you. And hopefully we'll have this out sooner rather than later. Maybe a little bit sooner than Christmas, but probably right around the Christmas time frame is when we're gonna go to market with it. So, all right. Well, listen, good talking to you.
You too, man.
I'll see you soon.
All right.
God bless.
Yeah.
Bye.